Today it is my very great pleasure to introduce what Langston Hughes would call two guiding stars of the literary world, Natasha Trethewey and Tracy K. Smith. These two highly acclaimed poets have already, in their young careers, brought so much beauty, grace, and insight into the world that it fills my heart to see them together, knowing that we are about to share more of the same. They're about to share more of the same with us today. We have as our honored guest, Natasha Trethewey, who I have to say is a friend of mine. I never could just say that. Natasha and Brett are very, very good friends of mine, so it's wonderful to have them here. Natasha Trethewey is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of English and the Director of the Creative Writing Program at Emory University. She is the author of 4 poetry collections, Domestic Work, Bullocksophilia, as I've told her many times, my personal favorite. I cannot now remember the first word I learned to write. Perhaps it was my name, Ophelia. Then the majestic Native Guard, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2007, and now Thrall, which was recently published. She has also written a work of creative nonfiction entitled Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize, Professor Trethewey is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the first annual Cave Canaan Foundation Poetry Prize, the Lillian Smith Book Award, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And then, in June of last year, James H. Billington of the Library of Congress announced Professor Trethewey as this year's Poet Laureate of the United States, the nation's 19th and the 3rd African-American woman to hold the post. Billington said of her poems, "They dig beneath the surface of history, personal and communal, from childhood or from a century ago, to explore the human struggles that we all face." In conversation with Natasha Trethewey is Princeton's own Tracy K. Smith. Tracy K. Smith is now, as I'm happy to announce, Professor of Creative Writing in the Lewis Center for the Arts. Congratulations. A graduate of Harvard and Columbia, and the recipient of the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and the Whiting Writers Award, Professor Smith is the author of 3 books of poetry: The Body's Question, for which she won the 2002 Cave Canaan Poetry Prize, Duende, for which she was awarded the James Laughlin Award and an Essence Literary Award, and Life on Mars, for which she won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. The New York Times reported, "As all the best poetry does, Life on Mars first sends us into the magnificent chill of the imagination, and then returns us to ourselves, both changed and consoled." So, having noted the many accomplishments of these two wonderful poets, and they are just getting started, I'm compelled to quote one of them as you will look upon them on the stage. "My God, it's full of stars." Please join me in welcoming Natasha Trethewey and Tracy K. Smith.
Good afternoon. So what we'll do is I've got some questions for Natasha, and we'll talk for a while, and then eventually we'll open the conversation up so that if you have questions, and we can go from there. But my first question has to do with an aim that I've often heard you state as one of your chief reasons for writing poetry, which is to write poems that will stand as monuments to our overlooked past. Often you've used the term erasure to describe what your poems are kind of seeking to undo. And so there's often this default of thinking about you as a public poet, a poet of public history. But there's also a really marvelous private dimension to your work that I'm really interested in. For example, your newest collection, Thrall, explores race and caste, but it also tells the story of your own family. Can you talk a little bit about the private dimension of your work and how you see the intersection between the public commitment that you have to history?
You know, Tracy, it's funny that you should say that, because depending on who's making that judgment, some people say my poems are deeply personal. It's as if they forget the historical component. And of course, I think that they are deeply personal and deeply historical at the same time, because I do try to chart the intersections as well as the contentions between our public history, our larger shared history, but also personal history, in the way that personal history always is bumping up against that, what is known, not known in the public sphere. And so, you know, my goal is to, first of all, examine the self in the ways that we do as poets, but to make sense of the self within a historical context. You know, I see myself, and I think, having grown up in Mississippi, being born in Mississippi in 1966, thinking of Heraclitus's axiom, geography is fate, I am a product of a particular place and its history that I've inherited. And so for me, I've always been a historical being and always trying to make sense of my place in the world.
I'm really interested in the way that that quest and that ability to see is something that permeates so many poems. I thought I wanted to ask you to read the poem Elegy to begin with, but I'm thinking now of a poem like Enlightenment as something that is thinking about an experience that you and your father had visiting a site of American history. But it's also a poem that allows us to think about the story of America. And I feel like it's something, a version of that story that we're often afraid to address, or and a version of private experience that's sometimes painful. Maybe I will ask you to read Elegy, because that's a poem that also seems courageous because of what it's willing to say.
Okay. So should I start with
Will you
Elegy?
start with that?
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things about the poem Elegy, which is the first poem in my new book, Thrall, is that, you know, as I was trying to figure out where to place any of the poems in this collection and figuring out that Elegy had to start it, I thought back to a conversation that I'd had with my father many years ago. My father, who has been writing about me my whole life, and I'd gotten to the point where now I was beginning to write back to some of his poems. And so I said to him, you know, late one night that, you know, I was going to write some poems about him. And my father, you know, ever witty and intellectual and ready with a quote that should put me in my place, said, quoting Yeats, of the quarrel with others we make rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. And I said to him, that's okay, that's what I did in Native Guard, and I can do it again. Here's an attempt to do it, and to draw attention to my own complicity in our relationship as father and daughter, and the way that as poets we've written about each other. Elegy for my father. I think by now the river must be thick with salmon. Late August, I imagine it as it was that morning, drizzle needling the surface, mist at the banks like a net settling around us, everything damp and shining. That morning, awkward and heavy in our hip waders, we stalked into the current and found our places, you upstream a few yards and out far deeper. You must remember how the river seeped in over your boots and you grew heavier with that defeat. All day I kept turning to watch you, how first you mimed our guide's casting, then cast your invisible line, slicing the sky between us. And later, rod in hand, how you tried again and again to find that perfect arc, flight of an insect skimming the river's surface. Perhaps you recall I cast my line and reeled in 2 small trout we could not keep. Because I had to release them, I confess, I thought about the past, working the hooks loose, the fish writhing in my hands, each one slipping away before I could let go. I can tell you now that I tried to take it all in, record it for an elegy I'd write one day when the time came. Your daughter, I was that ruthless. What does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? You kept casting your line, and when it did not come back empty, it was tangled with mine. Some nights, dreaming, I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed.
Thank you for reading that. That poem reminds us that the work of understanding the past is often something that can be ruthless or exacting. I'm really taken also by the emphasis on the word learned in that poem. I learned to be. Is it the craft of poetry that might have been one of those tools?
Well, I think it is about the craft of poetry, and also extending that to the idea of the craft of being a poet in the world, to be in the moment, so observant of the moment that it comes back to you when you sit down to make sense of it in a poem. When I was a little girl, I remember countless conversations with my father in which at some point he would almost seem to check out of the conversation, pull the little notepad that he kept in his front pocket out, and begin to write something down. And I always thought, what have I just said that makes my father want to write this down? What is going to be a poem that I just did or said to him? And that's what's happening to me in the midst of the poem Elegy. Instead of being fully in the moment with my father, I'm already imagining the poem I'm going to write about it. I'm already looking at it as if, oh yeah, that's a perfect metaphor for this or for that. I want to record this day so I can write about it. It's kind of like when you go to visit historic sites or beautiful places, you see some people who are not actually looking at them because they're behind a camera the entire time. Already sort of thinking of the object they're going to preserve rather than fully engaged in the moment. And so when I say I learned to be, it's a little bit about having that kind of almost out-of-body experience that a poet has, looking at the world for what might be made of it. But also, I learned it from my father, because that's exactly what he did when I was growing up.
I'm curious about the discomfort level that your father might have with that poem in particular, or some of the other poems in which he's a prominent subject, and he's being regarded in a way that's honest.
That's right. Well, I mean, as I said, because my father is a poet, he has been writing about me my whole life. And I think he's also, with great joy, anticipated me becoming a poet, but also with a great deal of trepidation because he knew I was going to set the record straight. And so, he does now have to contend with another version of the story, another way to see our shared experience, which is, of course, what I'm trying to do with the larger shared experience of American history.
Right.
How we have shared accounts of events, what gets recorded on the landscape with monuments, with the namings of roads and bridges, what's in the textbooks and sometimes what's left out. That's the same relationship to personal history, where we remember, we recall events differently. And so with that particular poem, my father really likes the poem. I think he encountered it in a magazine before he saw it from me. So he saw it out in the world before we'd had a conversation about it. And I actually did a long conversation with with the Atlantic Monthly on their website about the poem, including some drafts. And in that, I discussed some of the conversations that my father and I have had about it. So, for example, my father says, it's a beautiful poem, but those weren't trout you caught, those were guppies. And, I'm like, Daddy, I've caught trout before. I know what a trout looks like. But he was most upset with the way the poem seems to present him as not the greatest fisherman. That's what he was more worried about. And then, he also said that, and this may be a way of preserving a lack of knowledge about something that the poem's trying to suggest. My father sees it as a pre-elegy. He sees it as a thing that makes him feel lucky that he gets to see a beautiful elegy written for him before he is gone. And yet, I would point out that that's not what's being elegized in the poem.
Yeah. It's funny that the things that we are able to acknowledge, and then that other knowledge that happens as a result of a poem that might just go directly to the unconscious. I wonder if the poem On Happiness, which is toward the very end of the book, is kind of a companion piece to this poem. Would you read that?
Yeah,
and talk
sure.
to us about it?
Wrote this after that one, still trying to go back to that day and to continue to make sense of that day that we were out there. And it really even seems like a poem that was written later than the other one, I think, in that way. This is On Happiness. To see a flash of silver, pale undersides of the maple leaves catching light, quick movement at the edge of thought, is to be pulled back to that morning, to the river where it flashes still. A single fish breaking the water's surface, the almost caught taunting our lines until we give up at last and turn the boat toward home. Is to see it clearly, the salmon rolling, showing me a glimpse of the unattainable. Happiness I would give my father if I could. And then is to recall the permit he paid for that morning, see it creased in my back pocket, how he'd handed it to me, and I tucked it there as if a guarantee.
Which of the poems, and I guess I'm not just speaking about the poems in Thrall, but if you want, I remember reading an interview with you soon after Belloque's Ophelia had come out, and you said that one of the reasons why that persona became helpful to you is because you were pushing yourself to step outside of the I, the real I. And so I can imagine that a lot of the poems that we as poets write are designed to teach us something or to challenge something that we're comfortable with. And so I wonder which of the poems of this book or others might have been the most difficult for you, either because of, how they were built, or maybe even more interestingly, what they forced you to say and consider.
Well, I can think of a couple of ways to answer that. And if I read Enlightenment later on, one of the things about that poem was that it was the hardest one to write about my father, about my relationship with my father, because I did have to contend with some things that are difficult, are painful. To think that my father might have thought certain things was a difficult thing to deal with, and to say it out loud, not only to myself, but to the world about him, and then to him. But there were other poems in my previous collection, Native Guard, that were difficult for other reasons, but also rewarding in that way that they teach us something. There are several poems in the first section of Native Guard which are elegies to my mother, who died 25 years ago, or more than that, actually. And I began writing those poems when I moved back to Atlanta, because I moved back to the actual physical geography where I had endured that great loss. And the grief followed me there. And so I began to write those poems. But what I didn't know until writing a couple of them is that all those years I had also harbored a sense of survivor's guilt, that being alive and her being dead also had weighed on me. And I only found it out in the making of the poem. So I'm going to read the one that is my favorite for that, and also a poem that has a difficult story of coming into being. It took me about 5 years to write it. And early on in my journal, I had just started working with certain words that I was thinking of. I had written down a few lines, but also the word Erebus. I'd written down, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and just a few lines about feeling what it was like to go to sleep at night and to dream my mother alive. I have a couple of kinds of dreams about her. In one dream, I dream that she's alive, not that she's alive, I dream that she's dead, but that she's there to talk to me in the dream. And I know that she's gone, and the dream always feels like a lovely visitation. But in the other kind of dream, I dream her alive. I don't know that she's gone or that anything has happened. And waking up from that dream always takes a moment of realization that she is gone. And that makes the grief come rushing back at that moment, fresh. Which to me echoes the feeling that Orpheus must have had trying to lead Eurydice out of the underworld, knowing that he wasn't supposed to turn around, but doing it anyway, and thus banishing her back there. This is myth. I was asleep while you were dying. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow I make between my slumber and my waking. The Erebus I keep you in, still trying not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow, but in dreams you live, so I try taking you back into morning. Sleep heavy, turning, my eyes open, I find you do not follow. Again and again, this constant forsaking. Again and again, this constant forsaking. My eyes open, I find you do not follow. You back into morning, sleep heavy, turning. But in dreams you live, so I try taking, not to let go. You'll be dead again tomorrow. The Erebus I keep you in, still trying, I make between my slumber and my waking. It's as if you slipped through some rift, a hollow. I was asleep while you were dying. So when I first wrote the poem, it ended at the first half, right before that hinge, with the line, again and again, this constant forsaking. And one of the things that hit me with that line was that I wasn't sure who was forsaking whom when I wrote it. I think I must have at first felt abandoned by her, but in the dream, I'm the one who wakes up. I'm the one who banishes her back. And so the possibility of that hinge, that the forsaking fell on me rather than on her, is one of the things that led me to perhaps more subconsciously continue to work on the poem and put it aside for a long time. And finally, I was thinking about the late Agha Shahed Ali, who was one of my teachers at the University of Massachusetts, who always told us to read our poems, read the lines of each poem out of context, out of the syntactical or rhetorical structure of the poem, to see the line by itself to check the integrity of the line. And so I began to read the poem backwards so that I could remove the lines from the sentences they were a part of. And that's when I saw that with more work, the poem could actually enact Orpheus's descent into the underworld and his return out of it, and the moment when Eurydice doesn't finally come with him out.
That poem is so incredibly beautiful. I love hearing the story of how it was composed because I've wondered about that. But what really struck me when you were talking before reading the poem was the in speaking about grief, the grief at the very real and private loss of a parent, you can also move so quickly to a belief and identification with the myth, the mythical figures, and I think that's wonderful. I realize, or I suspect that that's something that is really kind of built into you. There are poems about having been read or read the myths as a child, and then you have, that poem, and then you have myth maker and mythology. Is that kind of a trilogy that sits across collections, or is it just a theme that's such a part of your sense of your own view of the world?
That is a really good question, to think of it as a trilogy across the collections. I am always concerned with the way that each of my collections speaks to another one, builds upon some of the themes and obsessions of mine that get introduced in one. A way of digging deeper for me each time with the things that I must return to again and again. And so I do think about that with the collections themselves. And I did even take note myself of the fact that there tends to be that word appearing in some construction in each of the collections. But I think even more it is about my early reading and listening and being read to. My father, each night before I went to bed, would tell bedtime stories, but the stories that he liked to tell were stories from mythology or stories from literature. And so in domestic work, he is presented as that myth maker who is telling me cautionary tales, telling me the story of Narcissus so that I will listen to him more. I'm sorry, well, no, telling me the story of Icarus so that I'll listen to him more, but telling me the story of Narcissus so that I won't be too taken with myself. But, my father also, and he would also tell lots of the stories, of the Odyssey. The Odyssey was, part of the mythology that he liked to tell me, and so, his favorite and the place he begins that I talk about in the poem Mythology was the part that has to do with hubris, I guess, also, which is, Odysseus in the cave and trying to get out and figuring out a clever way to blind the Cyclops, but then, of course, making the bad mistake of sort of revealing who he was in a tricky kind of way, but still doing that. But my father also would recite parts of Beowulf to me. I mean, he would often tell me the scene of Grendel beating on the mess hall door right before I went to sleep. Right. I don't think you can not be a poet if that's what happens to you before you go to bed.
Yeah. Was there a moment, you were writing fiction at one time, right? You did an MA in fiction?
Well, I went to an MA program in fiction, and within about a month and a half was told that I was not a fiction writer. I was told that I was a poet, but I think it was a way of saying you're not a fiction writer.
But was that choice even maybe about pushing against something that had been, you kind of been steeped in and betrothed to in a way?
No, my father was the one, talking me into being a fiction writer. I mean, he was the one that said I should do that, and I think that was, purely commercial on his part.
Oh, yeah.
I think he thought, oh, but you sell novels, you can make a living for yourself, for all of us. So, I mean, he also was, delighted to have me write poetry, but I think he thought that, my whole life my father kept saying, you have something to say. You have, because of who you are, because of the fate of your geography, you have stories to tell. And so I imagine that's why he was pushing me toward fiction at first.
I want to shift a little bit. Hopefully we'll come back to some of the other private things, but to the view of the world and of specific lives and of histories that your poetry is also deeply committed to. One way in your work that this happens is by concentrating on place. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sense of I want to bring the elegy into it somehow. Maybe the Beyond Katrina book could be the hinge here, because there's a distance through which place and the history that sits with it is viewed, and it's either a literal distance as pertains to time, or also memory. What are some of the differences that you've experienced writing about place in prose as opposed to poetry? Does that make sense?
It does. I went about writing Beyond Katrina not unlike I write poems. It was an extended lyrical meditation for me about the nature of loss and memory and forgetting, and particularly nostalgia. The danger of seeing places for something that they never were before, and the need to make places that way. Although learning that about myself in Beyond Katrina did help me see, I think in different ways, the way I had been writing, for example, about Mississippi before. Because I was writing about, these erased histories, because I was combining my own culpability in terms of memory and forgetting with national memory and erasure. I seemed in some ways more guilty of the personal erasure and not the public erasure. Writing Beyond Katrina taught me in some ways that seeing my home through that nostalgic lens also prevented me from seeing it as I thought I was seeing it in poems.
But it also seems like it's the degree to which every one of us is guilty of that kind of personal erasure that creates the public and the historic. You've even talked a little bit, I've heard you talk about being on panels of Southern writers and have someone kind of chirp in and say, well, the Southern psyche is like this because we lost the war, and as if they're oblivious to the fact that the we is not all-encompassing.
We won.
So I really feel like there's something, I want to believe that every poem can change our lives and our view of the world, but I really believe that your commitment to that sense of private recognition and, the revising out the omissions is something that over time would correct the public.
Well, it seems to me, and particularly in Thrall, that the only way to do that work and to gain the authority to have that argument with the nation or with the ways that people have thought and continue to think across time and space is to root that argument as an argument within the self as well. How can I say the nation is guilty of this unless I'm also willing to say, okay, but look how I've been guilty of it. And that is what gives me the authority to say, we've done it.
And that's also what, let's face it, what makes a poem stick to the page, right? If the speaker is also wrestling with the guilt of having committed something that's equally wrong. So, you're in a position now as the U.S. Poet Laureate to maybe change the conversation around topics like this, at least through poems. What are you aware of as some of the wishes and limitations that are within your, I don't know, wishes within your grasp and limitations that you might have to kind of defer to?
Well, you know, I am the poet that I am, which means that, you know, as you say, that I am concerned with particular subjects, difficult ones, and Thrall, I think the most difficult one of all, deals with history of knowledge, the Enlightenment, all the good things that come to us from the Enlightenment, tempered by the Enlightenment's way of not also at the same time codifying ideas of racial difference, white supremacy and black inferiority. To try to say that, to try to deal with that in terms of a history of knowledge, of ideology, it was absolutely necessary for me to also show how deeply intimate those things are as well. That you could have a loving father and love him dearly, and yet know that he holds deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of white supremacy that manifest themselves in a myriad of ways. And that phrase, white supremacy, is a tough phrase to hear. It is tough to hear it. And yet, anytime, you know, someone said to me, "Oh, you've done something good, that's your white side." Well, that's white supremacy. Or, "You're not like the rest of them." That's white supremacy. It comes out in the most benign ways, even more benign than those examples that I just gave, from people who are loving and dear to you. You know, I spent a semester at Yale, and I talked to Hazel Carby, the scholar there, a lot, who was also biracial. She's working on a book called Child of Empire. And one of the things that, you know, we both talked about is how, you know, her beloved mother, that, you know, even though, you know, she felt completely loved, there was always a place at some point that she knew her mother understood her as different, as other, and that was because of race. You know, even President Obama mentioned it in his speech on race, in which he's talking about his beloved white grandmother, and he gets to the moment in the speech and he says, "But nonetheless." It's the nonetheless. I kind of went off on a tangent about that, but I want to bring it back to say that those are difficult conversations, and you would think that because of the difficulty of our ongoing conversations about race in America, that it could be contentious or difficult, and yet that's not what I've encountered thus far. And one of the things that has made me feel safer even to continue the work I must do is that I meet people all the time, you know, who will come up and say that they hadn't thought about a certain thing, or that, you know, the ways that poems not only help us reckon with our shared and deeply difficult past, but they also help us to imagine a better world. They help us to imagine a more just and humane society that we are every day working together to build. And so because of that, because it's in the language of poetry, that the elegant envelope of a poem, it makes listening a little easier. It makes listening a little bit more desirable. And I also feel like, you know, the Librarian of Congress has read my books. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. And he wouldn't have installed me in this post if he didn't think, I think also, that it was a conversation worth having, and that maybe the poems were the way to have it. And so I feel empowered to continue to do the work that I do because of it.
I want to ask you to read the poem Enlightenment before.
It's a good time to read that,
Yeah.
actually. I've been talking so much about it.
Yeah.
The poem I'm going to read is actually probably about the last poem that I wrote for the book, and I knew that I had to write it. You know how that is? Like, there's a poem you got to write, or the book's not going to come together. And so, in order to write it, I knew that I had to take my father to Monticello. My father took me to Monticello the first time over 20 years ago. And, things were obviously different in these many years since we'd been there last. And the main difference is that it is now the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 2 of Sally Hemings' children. That changes some of the conversations that you overhear when you're at Monticello as well. So now that we've acknowledged that, there are different things to then discuss. And my father, because he is someone deeply committed to the Enlightenment, and the first person who started getting me to read, some of the Enlightenment scholars that he was interested in, from Kant to Jefferson, we've also debated these things over the years, because once I started to read them, I began also to see those controversial and more contentious ideas about race and racial difference, which made me say, okay, Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves, that his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years, we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other.
There's so much to say about the poem. The first thing I want to say has to do with the fact that the entry into the poem has to do with the portrait. And there's something about the world of visual art that seems to really invite you to imagine stories and derive insights. Can you talk about that a little bit? We have, the photographs that, not only the photographs that run through your first book, Domestic Work, but also the photographs that drive Philopsophilia and the paintings that you focus on in several poems in Thrall.
It seems to me that I've always been very visual, that is the image, the type of image that is strongest or most strongly developed in me, or the one I'm at least most consciously attuned to. When I was growing up, I would try to memorize the way that my grandmother's house looked, because I missed her deeply when I had to leave Mississippi at the end of the summer to go back to Atlanta. And I wanted to keep the image of the place in my head. And so I began to do that all the time, to make pictures of what it is I was trying to keep in the way that memory does that for us. And so it seemed quite natural for me to want to begin always with the given image and to move from there. So with photographs, for me it is to begin there in some ways in description, and to move then to imagining what's happened just before or just after a photograph, to imagine what is being left out of the frame, the kinds of erasures that I'm interested in, what's been cropped, what about the perspective makes us see it differently than we might also see it if we look through a slightly different lens. And it's the same way, I think, for me with paintings. I mean, paintings also have those kinds of perspectives and cropping and framing, and they also function in a kind of documentary way to me, the way photographs do. They present as material culture, a particular moment in history, the way the artist saw things, as well as the ways that the viewers, for example, in some of the 18th century paintings that I've written about, the way the people who saw it might have understood what was being represented there and how that reflected their own lives. And so, I love to start there. And even when I'm not actually looking at a photograph or a painting, I always start with a picture in my head before I can write a word.
I love the way that the poem, is it called Juan Pareja?
Yes.
And maybe that's another one that you would read if you don't mind. Creates a sense of his understanding of himself by way of how he is depicted, and then the distance between his father, or rather the painter and the canvas, and then
it is almost his father, isn't it?
And then the agency with which he begins to paint on his own, and somehow that feels analogous to the relationship to history that you're thinking about, and that we can also imagine the subjects of the other of your poems, even if they're not subjects of visual art, like the Native Guard soldiers who write the beautiful letters in your.
The thing about that Velázquez painting of Juan de Pareja that was so amazing to me when I saw it, when I was working on Thrall, I was trying to search for images of representations of Africans in visual art across several centuries, from the Renaissance, to colonial Mexico. And that's one of the paintings that I came across. And so I started to read a little bit about Velázquez and Pareja and their relationship, because Pareja was a slave of Velázquez's before he manumitted him. And Velázquez famously painted that portrait of Juan de Pareja in order to practice for a painting that he was going to make of the Pope. And people praised the painting tremendously. It's a great painting. And Juan de Pareja in it looks so wide-eyed. Just the openness of his face, and people reportedly said, oh, it looks exactly like him, and so it was a marvel of, perfect representation. And then, come to find out that Pareja is also a painter and is known for his painting, The Calling of St. Matthew, in which he did a thing which must have been common for painters, to put himself in the painting.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see him in the painting, his representation of himself is so not like Velázquez's representation. I mean, he's literally looking much shrewder. You know, his eyes are narrowed as if to say, I know more than you think I do. I mean, of course, that's at least how I would see it, because having been the daughter of someone who sees me the way he sees me, and what we struggle as children, you know, of parents, to try to assert our own identity, that bumps up often against with how others see us, how our elders, how our parents see us. I know that I must have been taken with just those two images, just the different way that Pareja's eyes were represented, depending on who was doing it. And of course, by starting to write about that, I realized that in his story is everything about mine. You know, that he was, you know, the son of a black woman, you know, sort of taken away and sold into slavery, given to, you know, to be in the studio of a man who was good to him in many ways, you know, that he was able to apprentice himself to. And so you have, you know, Pareja as an artist becoming a painter like his father, and me becoming a poet like my father. So all the things were there, even as I wasn't quite seeing it like that until the poem got written. And so I began to see it as something about the nature of fatherhood, the nature of inheritance, apprenticeship, seeing oneself differently than you're seen by someone else. But also, even in Pareja's story, the absence of his mother, that loss that still, I imagine, haunted him the rest of his days.
Yeah. Would you read that poem?
It might be, should I finish there? Because I think it's a little longer.
Okay.
Is it?
Or even if you just want to read one, maybe the final section, or
I'll read maybe just a couple of sections, or the first and the last.
Okay, and then I'll share. I have more
Those
questions, but I'll share.
Okay, I'll just read, let's see. Yeah, I know the ones to read. Okay, so these are just a few of the sections from Thrall, which is in the voice of Juan de Pareja, 1670. He was not my father, though he might have been. I came to him the mulatto son of a slave woman, just that, as if it took only my mother to make me a mulatto, meaning any white man could be my father. In his shop, bound to the muller, I ground his colors, my hands dusted black with fired bone, stained blue and flecked with glass, my nails edged vermilion as if my fingertips bled. In this way, just as I turned the pages of his books, I meant to touch everything he did. How intently at times could he fix his keen eye upon me, though only once did he fix me in paint. My color a study, my eyes wide as I faced him, a lace collar at my shoulders, as though I'd been born noble, the yoke of my birth gone from my neck. In his hand a long brush to keep him far from the canvas, far from it as I was. The distance between us doubled that he could observe me twice, stand closer to what he made. For years I looked to it as one looks into a mirror. And so, in the calling of St. Matthew, I painted my own likeness, a freeman in the house of customs waiting to pay my duty. In my hand an answer, a slip of paper, my signature on it, Juan de Pareja, 1661, Velázquez, 1 year gone. Behind me, upright on a shelf, a forged platter, luminous as an aureole just beyond my head, my face turned to look out from the scene, a self-portrait. To make it, I looked at how my master saw me. Then I narrowed my eyes. Now, at the bright edge of sleep, mother. She comes back to me as sound, her voice in the echo of bird call, a single syllable again and again, my name, one, or a bit of song that, waking, I cannot grasp.
Thank you. I'd love to share this opportunity to ask Natasha questions with all of you. So, and I'd even share the microphone if that would be helpful too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, actually, since I've been at the library, which is a tremendously beautiful space, if you've been to the Library of Congress, it's beautiful. If you've ever gone up to the Poetry and Literature Center, or if you haven't, you should visit it. I hold office hours there now on Mondays and Tuesdays in the laureate's office. It's a beautiful space. I have a set of French doors that opens onto a balcony that overlooks the Capitol building. And so being in there is something that I want to experience every moment of while I'm there. And so I keep saying to myself, there's moments when I want to document everything, and I call the staff in and say, let's take a picture of this. Richard Blanco is here with me. Let's take a picture of this. But then I say to myself, just be here. Just be in it. I know that the impressions of my year there will be enough to stay with me if I need to write poems about it in the future. This might look like we could adjourn. We could give ourselves. Oh, did you hear that? I'm kidding. Well, how about that? You've been a lovely audience, and maybe we should adjourn to whatever comes next.
Okay. Well, there will be books to be signed. Natasha will be signing books, I think, here. I'll sign some books over there, but you should take advantage of her visit to Princeton.
Yes. Well, let's thank our guests today.